December 1944. The Ardennes Forest. The snow came down not as flakes, but as a fine crystalline dust, a relentless sifting of white that coated everything in a shroud of silence and cold. For Günter, a panzer grenadier of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, this silence was a lie. The forest was not silent. It was alive with the creak of frozen branches, the distant muffled crump of artillery, and the low guttural growl of his own empty stomach. He lay in a shallow foxhole, scraped from the frozen earth, his body a tight knot of shivering muscle. His great coat, stiff with ice, was a poor defense against a cold that seemed to radiate not from the air, but from the very soil of Belgium. He was 19 years old, and he was a veteran. He had been a veteran since the blood-soaked fields of Normandy, where he had watched boys he had grown up with, boys he had sung anthems with, in the Hitlerjugend, vanish in the fiery blast of naval shells. He had survived the retreat across France, a long fighting withdrawal that had stripped away the bravado of youth and replaced it with a hard, cold core of professional resolve. And now he was here, a part of the great last gamble offensive that was supposed to shatter the Allied armies and turn the tide of the war. He still believed in it. He had to. Belief was the only thing that kept the cold at bay. He clutched his rifle, a Sturmgewehr 44, a weapon as revolutionary and as beautiful as the cause he fought for. It was a marvel of German engineering, a masterpiece of stamped steel and elegant design. He knew every part of it by heart, every pin and every spring. He kept it meticulously clean, a sacrament against the encroaching chaos of the war. His rifle was a symbol of his world, a world of precision, of strength, of a martial spirit that had been honed over 1,000 years of German history. He looked across the snowy expanse, towards the American lines. He could see nothing, only the dark, silent woods. But he knew they were there. The Americans. The Amis. The word itself was a sneer on his lips, a taste of contempt. He knew them, not from personal experience, but from a lifetime of instruction. He knew them from the posters that showed them as grotesque, ape-like figures, their pockets bulging with money, their faces a mask of greedy stupidity. He knew them from the newsreels that depicted their leaders as puppets of a global Jewish conspiracy. He knew them from the lectures of his Hitlerjugend leaders, who had taught him that America was a mongrel nation, a chaotic mix of races, a society rotten with jazz music, gangsterism, and a decadent materialism that had sapped its will to fight. He believed these things not because he was a fool, but because every aspect of his life had been a confirmation of them. His Germany was a nation of discipline, of sacrifice, of spiritual unity. The German soldier, he had been taught, was the finest in the world, not because of his equipment, but because of his Geist, his spirit, his willingness to endure hardship and to die for a cause greater than himself. The American soldier, by contrast, was an amateur, a soft boy raised on comfort and plenty, a man who fought for a paycheck, not for a sacred homeland. He was an opponent to be respected for his material, for his endless supply of tanks and planes, but to be despised for his lack of soul. A flicker of movement in the trees brought him back to the present. He raised his rifle, his breath a cloud of white in the frigid air. The silence stretched. The war for now was a waiting game. And in the waiting, there was hunger. His stomach, a hollow ache beneath his ribs, was a constant unwelcome companion. He reached into his bread bag and pulled out a piece of kommissbrot. It was hard, almost frozen, a dense dark brick of rye flour, sawdust, and the vague sour taste of desperation. He gnawed on a corner, the rough texture scraping the roof of his mouth. This too was a part of his identity. To eat this bread, to endure this hunger, was a sign of his strength. The American soldiers, he thought with a flicker of pride, were probably sitting in their heated tents, complaining about their canned meals. Let them. Their softness would be their undoing. He did not know, he could not possibly imagine, that in a few weeks' time, his entire world, his entire system of belief, would be shattered, not by a tank or a bomb, but by something so simple, so mundane, and so profoundly American, that it would defy all of his categories of understanding. He could not imagine that he would be confronted with a piece of food that was not a symbol of sacrifice, but of a casual, almost thoughtless abundance. He was a soldier of the Reich, a product of a world of ersatz and endurance. He was about to be captured by an army that had as a routine part of its logistical train the ability to produce, cook, and serve a hot, juicy, and utterly baffling creation of ground meat on a soft white bun. He was about to taste a hamburger, and in that taste, he would find a truth more devastating than any military defeat. To understand the world that had shaped Günter, one must return to the city of his birth, Essen, the steel heart of the German Reich. His childhood was not a memory of bucolic fields, but of the rhythmic, earth-shaking thunder of the great Krupp works, a sound that was the heartbeat of his city and his nation. The air he breathed was thick with the metallic scent of coal smoke and hot steel. The sky, even on a summer day, was a hazy grey, a permanent testament to the industrial power that was Germany's pride and its destiny. His father was a steelworker at Krupp, a master craftsman, a man whose hands were a map of scars and calluses. He was a quiet, proud man, who believed in the simple virtues of hard work, discipline, and loyalty. He would come home from the foundry, his face streaked with soot, and his presence would fill their small apartment with the smell of his labor. He was a socialist in his youth, a believer in the power of the worker, but like many Germans of his generation, he had seen the chaos of the Weimar Republic, the humiliation of Versailles, the shame of hyperinflation, and he had found a new faith in the promises of Adolf Hitler. The Führer, he would tell Günter, had restored Germany's honor. He had put men back to work, he had rebuilt the army, he had made Germany strong again. Günter's mother was the quiet center of their world. Her life was a constant silent battle against scarcity. She was a magician of the kitchen, a woman who could turn a few potatoes, a cabbage, and a piece of fatty bacon into a hearty, comforting stew. Her world was a world of ration cards, of queues at the butcher shop, of the small daily triumphs and tragedies, of making a home in a nation that was constantly preparing for, or fighting, a war. But even in this world of scarcity, there were moments of grace. Günter remembered the smell of his mother's Apfelkuchen on a Sunday afternoon, the sweet warm scent of baked apples and cinnamon, a smell that was for him, the very definition of peace and security. This was the world that was swept away by the coming of the war. But for a boy of Günter's generation, the war was not a tragedy, it was an adventure. It was the glorious fulfillment of a destiny that he had been prepared for since he was a small child. His true education had not taken place in the formal, stuffy classrooms of the local school, but in the vibrant, intoxicating world of the Hitlerjugend, the Hitler Youth. At the age of 10, he had joined the Deutsches Jungvolk, the junior branch of the Hitler Youth. He had been given his first uniform, a simple brown shirt and black shorts, and a dagger with the inscription Blut und Ehre, blood and honor. It was the proudest moment of his young life. He was no longer just a boy, he was a part of something vast, something powerful, something eternal. The life of the Hitler Youth was a life of structured adventure. There were the weekly meetings, the Heimbände, where they would sing the powerful, stirring songs of the movement, songs of camaraderie, of sacrifice, and of glorious death for the fatherland. There were the weekend camping trips, where they would learn to read a map, to tie knots, to march for miles with heavy packs, to cook their meager meals over an open fire. It was a life designed to strip away the softness of civilian life, to turn them from boys into young wolves, hard, disciplined, and utterly loyal to the Führer. And there were the lectures. They were taught the gospel of National Socialism. They learned about the purity of the Aryan race, about the sacred bond between the German people and their soil, the Blut und Boden. And they learned about their enemies. They learned about the treachery of the Jews, who had stabbed Germany in the back in 1918. They learned about the barbarism of the Slavic Untermenschen in the East. And they learned about the decadence of the West, particularly America. America, their leaders told them, was a nation without a soul. It was a chaotic jumble of races, a half-Judaized, half-negrified society, as Hitler himself had written in Mein Kampf. It was a nation whose only god was money, whose only culture was the shallow, noisy vulgarity of jazz music and Hollywood films. Its people were soft, its men were effeminate, its soldiers were mercenaries who lacked the spiritual fortitude to stand up to the disciplined, idealistic German Lancer. The American system of democracy was a sham, a chaotic and inefficient form of government that was a pale shadow of the dynamic, unified will of the Führer state. This was the catechism of Günter's youth, and he believed it with the simple, unquestioning faith of a true believer. At the age of 14, he graduated to the Hitler Youth proper. The training became more rigorous, more military. He learned to handle a small caliber rifle, to throw a grenade, to dig a trench. The games became war games. The songs became battle hymns. He and his comrades were being forged into the next generation of soldiers, the generation that would secure the 1,000-year Reich. When the war began in 1939, Günter was too young to fight, but he participated in the war effort with a fervent enthusiasm. He collected scrap metal, he helped with the harvest, he acted as a messenger during air raid drills. He watched the newsreels of the Blitzkrieg in Poland and France with a swelling pride. He saw the panzers, his nation's steel eagles, smashing through the decadent and unprepared armies of the West, and he yearned for the day when he too could take his place in the ranks. That day came in 1943. He was drafted into the army, and because of his perfect physical condition and his demonstrated ideological fervor as a member of the Hitler Youth, he was selected for one of the most elite formations of the German military, the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend. This was a division composed almost entirely of former members of the Hitler Youth, young men of 17, 18, and 19, who were to be the purest expression of the National Socialist warrior. Their training was brutal, even by the standards of the SS. They were pushed to the absolute limits of their physical and mental endurance. They were taught to kill without hesitation, to obey without question, and to die without fear. Their commander, the charismatic and ruthless SS Brigade Führer Fritz Witt, told them, "You are the future of Germany. You will be the hardest, the most ruthless, and the most feared soldiers on the battlefield. You will show the world the meaning of German steel." The doctrine of the Hitlerjugend division was one of pure fanatical aggression. They were taught to attack, always to attack. They were taught to close with the enemy, to destroy him in close combat with the rifle, the grenade, and the bayonet. They were the embodiment of the Nazi ideal of the will to power, the belief that a small group of ideologically pure and fanatically brave soldiers could overcome any material disadvantage. And the material disadvantages were becoming increasingly apparent. By 1944, the German war machine was beginning to show the strain of a long multi-front war. The new recruits of the Hitlerjugend division were equipped with the best weapons the Reich could produce: the superb MG-42 machine gun, the powerful Panther tank, and Günter's own revolutionary Sturmgewehr 44. But behind this cutting edge of steel, the logistical foundations of the army were crumbling. The food, as always, was the most obvious sign. The rations were becoming smaller, the quality poorer, the Kommissbrot was denser, the ersatz coffee more bitter. Meat was a memory. The young soldiers, with the ravenous appetites of teenagers, were in a state of constant gnawing hunger. But they had been taught to see this as a virtue. Hunger was a test of their will, a purification of the body and the spirit. They were, they believed, being hardened in the fire of sacrifice. In the spring of 1944, the division was moved to Normandy. They were a part of the armored reserve, held back from the coast, ready to be unleashed as the fire brigade that would smash any Allied landing and drive the invaders back into the sea. The mood among the young soldiers was one of supreme, almost arrogant confidence. They had been told that the Atlantic Wall was impregnable. They had been told that the Americans were soft, and that the British were exhausted. They were convinced that the coming invasion would be the day of the German army, the moment when they would finally have the chance to prove their superiority on the battlefield. The invasion, when it came on June 6th, was a shock, but not a surprise. The men of the Hitlerjugend division were rushed to the front, to the area north of the city of Caen, where they were thrown into a brutal head-on collision with the advancing British and Canadian armies. The battle for Caen was a meat grinder, a World War I-style battle of attrition fought in the lush green and deadly hedgerow country of Normandy. For Günter it was a baptism of fire. He saw things that the sanitized newsreels had never shown him. He saw the incredible, overwhelming power of Allied artillery and naval gunfire, a storm of steel that could turn an entire village into a smoking crater in a matter of minutes. He saw the sky, filled with Allied fighter bombers, the Jabos, that seemed to be everywhere at once, strafing and bombing any German vehicle that dared to move during the day. And he saw death on a scale that was almost unimaginable. He saw his friends, the boys he had sung with around the campfire in the Hitler Youth, torn apart by shrapnel, burned to death in their tanks, cut down by machine gun fire. But he also saw the confirmation of what he had been taught. He saw the incredible courage and fighting skill of his own comrades. The young soldiers of the Hitlerjugend division fought with a fanatical ferocity that stunned their veteran British and Canadian opponents. They would hold their ground against impossible odds. They would launch suicidal counterattacks. They would fight to the last man and the last bullet. They were proving that the German spirit was indeed a powerful weapon, and they were learning to hate their enemy with a deep and personal passion. They were fighting an enemy they could not see, an enemy who fought with machines, with artillery, with air power. It seemed to them a cowardly way to fight, and when they did come face to face with the enemy, they saw the evidence of their material wealth. They would find captured Allied positions littered with the detritus of an army of abundance, discarded food tins, cigarette packets, chocolate bar wrappers. They would strip the bodies of dead Allied soldiers and find them to be well fed, their uniforms of high-quality wool, their boots of sturdy leather. It was a source of both envy and a deep burning resentment. The retreat from Normandy, after the American breakout at Saint-Lô, was a nightmare. The Hitlerjugend division, which had been decimated in the fighting around Caen, was caught in the great Allied encirclement of the Falaise pocket. It was a scene from Dante's Inferno. The roads were a choked, chaotic mass of retreating German vehicles, all of them being systematically destroyed by Allied artillery and fighter bombers. The sky was black with smoke, the air was thick with the stench of burning fuel and death. Günter survived, but he was no longer the arrogant, confident young soldier who had gone into battle in June. He was a hardened, weary, and deeply disillusioned veteran. He had seen the failure of his own high command, the overwhelming material superiority of the enemy, and the death of most of his friends. But his belief in the fundamental rottenness of the enemy, and the fundamental righteousness of his own cause, was still intact. It was the last thing he had left to cling to. And so, in the winter of 1944, he found himself in the Ardennes, in a snow-filled foxhole, his stomach empty, his body cold, but his spirit still burning with a defiant flame. He was a product of a system that had taught him that sacrifice was strength, that hunger was a virtue, and that the enemy was a decadent, materialistic fool. He was about to be captured, and he was about to be offered a hamburger. The collision between his world and the world that was contained in that simple, humble piece of food would be more violent and more decisive than any battle he had ever fought. The final hours of Günter's life as a soldier of the Third Reich were a blur of chaos, terror, and the deafening, earth-shaking roar of American artillery. The American counterattack, when it came, was not a subtle probing maneuver. It was a sledgehammer, a brutal, overwhelming application of pure industrial-scale firepower. The shells came down not in a predictable rolling barrage, but in a series of terrifying instantaneous concentrations, the dreaded time-on-target strikes, that turned the snow-covered forest into a churning cauldron of fire and steel. Trees, stripped of their branches, became a forest of jagged splinters. The frozen earth was torn apart, exposing the black wounded soil beneath. The sound was not a series of explosions, but a single continuous physical blow that vibrated in a man's bones and threatened to shatter his sanity. Günter lay in his foxhole, his body pressed so hard against the frozen ground that he felt he was becoming a part of it. He was no longer a soldier, he was a terrified animal, burrowing for his life. The world was reduced to the smell of cordite, the taste of dirt in his mouth, and the screams of his comrades. When the shelling finally lifted, the silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the noise. It was a dead, ringing silence, the silence of a world that had been broken. And then through the smoke and the falling snow, they came. They were not the soft, cowardly soldiers of the propaganda posters. They were big, well-fed men, clad in heavy winter gear, their faces grim and determined. They moved with a slow, methodical, and terrifying confidence. They did not charge, shouting and screaming in the German fashion. They advanced in a series of short, controlled rushes, a tactic they called fire and maneuver. One group would lay down a withering hail of fire from their semi-automatic Garand rifles, a volume of fire that was impossible for the German bolt-action Kar 98Ks to match. While the Germans were keeping their heads down,
another group of Americans would advance, and then the process would be repeated. It was a slow, grinding and inexorable advance, the advance of a machine, and they had tanks. Not the elegant, powerful panthers and tigers that Günter revered, but the ugly, utilitarian M4 Shermans. There were dozens of them. They seemed to be everywhere, their high-profile hulls looming through the trees like prehistoric beasts. They were not as well armored or as heavily gunned as the German tanks, but there were so many of them. The German anti-tank gunners, the Panzerknackers, fought with a suicidal courage, their Panzerschrecks and Panzerfaust spitting fire and smoke. They would knock out one Sherman, and two more would appear to take its place. It was a battle against a Hydra, a monster that could not be killed. Günter's unit, what was left of it, was overrun in a matter of minutes. He saw his company commander, a hardened veteran of the Eastern Front, cut down by a burst of machine gun fire. He saw a young boy, a replacement who had just joined the unit a week before, simply disintegrate in the blast of a tank's main gun. There was no glory, no heroism, just a sudden, brutal and impersonal ending. Günter fired his Sturmgewehr until the bolt locked back on an empty chamber. He reached for a new magazine, and his hand closed on nothing. He was out of ammunition. The moment of truth had arrived. He had been taught that surrender was the ultimate disgrace, that a German soldier fought to the last breath. He looked at the bayonet lug on his rifle. He thought of the stories of glorious death, of the songs he had sung in the Hitler Youth. But when he looked up and saw the cold, impassive muzzle of a Sherman tank's coaxial machine gun swinging towards his foxhole, the propaganda and the songs and the stories all dissolved into a single primal, an overwhelming desire to live. He dropped his rifle, and slowly, shakily, raised his hands above his head. A big American infantryman, his face covered in soot, his eyes weary but not cruel, motioned with his rifle for Günter to climb out of the foxhole. "Comrades," he said in a surprisingly good German accent. "Für dich ist der Krieg vorbei." For you the war is over. The hours that followed were a journey into a new and terrifying dimension of defeat. Günter and the other survivors of his unit were herded into a group, their hands laced behind their heads. They were searched, disarmed, and stripped of any personal items of value, a watch, a ring, a locket. It was a swift, impersonal, and deeply humiliating process. They were no longer soldiers, they were chattel, the spoils of war. They were marched to the rear, a long shuffling column of grey-green ghosts in the white landscape. They passed the evidence of the Americans' logistical might. They saw the endless columns of trucks, the juice and halves, moving bumper to bumper on the narrow forest roads, bringing up the fuel and the ammunition, and the food that fed this ravenous war machine. They saw the American engineers, already at work with their massive bulldozers, clearing the roads and repairing the bridges. They saw the mobile field kitchens, set up in the clearings, the smoke from their chimneys rising into the cold air, a promise of a hot meal that was no longer for them. They were taken to a temporary collection point, a barbed wire enclosure in a snow-covered field, and it was here that the first strange and unsettling encounter with American food culture took place. They were not given a hot meal, not yet. They were given a K-ration. It was a simple wax-coated cardboard box, but to the hungry German prisoners, it was a treasure chest of wonders. Günter opened his box with fumbling, half-frozen fingers. Inside he found a small can of processed meat, a packet of hard rectangular biscuits, a fruit bar, a packet of instant coffee, 4 cigarettes, and a small flat dark brown bar that he did not recognize. A fellow prisoner, who had been captured in Normandy, saw his confusion. "Chocolade," he said, with a mixture of wonder and bitterness. Chocolate. Günter had not tasted real chocolate since he was a small boy. He unwrapped the bar and took a bite. The taste was so intense, so sweet, so overwhelmingly rich, that it was almost painful. It was a taste of a world he had forgotten existed, but it was the can of meat that was the true revelation. He opened it with the small key-like opener that was provided. Inside was a finely ground, pinkish mixture of pork and ham. It was a product of the Hormel Company, a creation of the American heartland. It was called Spam. He ate it with his fingers, scooping the cold, salty meat from the can. It was not a gourmet meal, but it was meat. It was pure, unadulterated protein. It was a caloric density that his body had not known in years. As he ate, he looked at the American guards who were watching them. They were eating too. They were eating the same K rations. This was a profound and deeply unsettling discovery. The Americans did not have a separate, inferior ration for their prisoners. They were feeding their enemies the same food that they were feeding themselves. This was not an act of kindness, it was an act of logistics. It was a demonstration of a system so vast and so efficient that it did not need to make a distinction. It was a system of such overwhelming abundance that it could afford to be indifferent. In the days that followed, the journey into captivity continued. Günter and his fellow prisoners were loaded onto trucks, and then onto trains, for the long journey to the rear. And at every stop, at every transit camp, the story was the same. They were given food, not just to keep them alive, but to nourish them. They were given hot coffee with sugar. They were given white bread, and on one memorable day, in a large, noisy and chaotic processing center in a French city, they were given their first American hot meal. It was served from a mobile field kitchen, a rolling marvel of stainless steel and efficiency, and the meal was a hamburger. Günter, like Klaus before him, had never seen such a thing. He was handed a plate with a warm, round, and surprisingly soft white bun. Inside was a thick, round patty of grilled ground beef. It was, to his German sensibilities, a formless and primitive creation. Where was the art, the tradition, the craft of the German butcher? This was just a lump of meat, but the smell was intoxicating, the rich, smoky aroma of grilled beef. And when he bit into it, the experience was a sensory explosion. The soft bun, the juicy, flavorful meat, the sharp tang of the pickle that was served with it. It was a combination of flavors and textures that was utterly alien and utterly delicious. He ate it, and then he looked at the American cook who had served it to him, and he saw that the cook was eating one too. And then he looked at the American officer who was supervising the processing, and he was eating one too. And then he looked at the driver of a nearby jeep, and he was eating one too. It was in that moment that Günter began to understand. The hamburger was not a meal, it was a cultural institution. It was a symbol of a society that had democratized pleasure, that had turned the luxury of ground beef into an everyday, accessible food for everyone. It was the food of a nation that did not see food as a problem of scarcity to be managed, but as a resource of abundance to be enjoyed. The German command had laughed at the stories of American softness. They had built an ideology on the virtue of Spartan endurance, and they had sent their young men like Günter, to fight a war fueled by ersatz coffee and sawdust bread. They had been defeated, not just by the weight of American steel, but by the simple, undeniable, and overwhelming power of a well-fed and confident nation. The hamburger was not just a meal, it was a verdict. It was the taste of a victory that had been won not on the battlefields of the Ardennes, but in the vast, fertile, and impossibly rich heartland of a nation that had turned the production of abundance into the ultimate weapon of war. The arrival in the United States was a disorienting, almost dreamlike experience. For Günter, who had never been outside of Germany, except to fight in France and Belgium, the sheer scale of America was a physical shock. The transport ship, after a long and nauseating voyage across the winter Atlantic, sailed into the harbor of New York City. The German prisoners were herded onto the deck, and they stared in a stunned, profound silence. The skyline of Manhattan, even in the grey light of a winter morning, was a vision from another world. It was not a city, it was a mountain range of steel and glass, a forest of towers that scraped the clouds, and it was completely, utterly untouched by the war.
Günter thought of the cities of his homeland, of Essen, a smoking ruin, of Cologne, a wasteland of rubble with the cathedral spire rising like a lonely tombstone, of Hamburg, a city that had been consumed by a firestorm. He had seen the photographs in the German newspapers, the sanitized images of heroic resistance amidst the destruction, but here before his eyes was a city that did not know the meaning of the word rubble. It was a city that was not just surviving, but thriving, a city that pulsed with an energy and a confidence that was as alien to him as the language he heard being shouted on the docks. The Statue of Liberty, which their ship passed on the way in, was a source of bitter, ironic amusement. Freiheit, one of the older prisoners sneered. Freedom. They bring us here in chains to show us a statue of freedom, but for Günter the statue was not an irony, it was a mystery. It represented a concept, an ideal, that was completely at odds with the world of discipline, of obedience, of collective will, that had shaped him. The processing at the port was a model of American efficiency. They were unloaded, counted, deloused, and put on trains with a speed and an orderliness that was in its own way as intimidating as any display of military force. And it was on the train journey into the heart of the country that the true staggering scale of American abundance began to reveal itself. The journey was a slow-motion revelation, a rolling lesson in the geography of power. The train passed through the industrial heartland of Pennsylvania and Ohio. Günter stared, mesmerized, at the endless succession of factories, of steel mills, of foundries. Their smokestacks poured a thick black smoke into the sky, a sign not of destruction, but of a relentless, 24-hour-a-day production. At night, the mills glowed with the fierce orange light of their blast furnaces. It was a vision of an industrial machine that was not just undamaged, but was operating at a level of intensity that made the Krupp works of his childhood seem like a village blacksmith shop. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that his father, the proud German steelworker, had been fighting a losing battle from the very beginning. And then the landscape changed. The industrial East gave way to the agricultural Midwest, and it was here that the true soul-crushing scale of America became apparent. The train traveled for days, and the view from the window never changed. It was a flat, endless expanse of land, divided into a neat geometric grid of farms. The fields stretched to the horizon, a checkerboard of brown earth and golden stubble, and on these fields, there were machines, tractors, combines, harvesters, machines of a size and a complexity that Günter had never imagined. He saw a single farmer, riding on a massive tractor, plowing a field that was larger than his entire home village. And there was livestock. He saw herds of cattle that were not herds, but rivers of brown and white, stretching for miles. He saw vast fields filled with thousands of hogs. He had been taught that Germany's quest for Lebensraum, for living space, was a historical necessity, a desperate struggle for the agricultural land needed to feed its people. And here was a country that had so much land, so much food, that it seemed not to know what to do with it all. The food on the train was a continuation of the astonishing rations they had been given in the transit camps. But it was the Hamburger, which made its first appearance in a dining car on the second day of the journey, that was the true cultural landmark. It was served to them on a plate, with a side of fried potatoes, what the Americans called French fries, another baffling name. The German prisoners, who had been taught to eat with a knife and a fork, were at first unsure of how to approach this strange sandwich. They watched the American guards, who picked it up with their hands, and ate it with a casual, almost primal enjoyment. Hesitantly, Günter picked his up. It was warm, and the soft white bun yielded to his grip. He bit into it. And once again, he was struck by the simple, unadorned, and deeply satisfying quality of it. The grilled beef, the soft bread, the sharp tang of the pickle. It was a food that was utterly without pretense. It was not the complex, multi-layered creation of a European chef. It was a simple, democratic, and incredibly effective delivery system for protein and calories. As he ate, a thought, a heretical and deeply disturbing thought, began to form in his mind. The German culture, the culture he had been taught to revere, was a culture of the spirit, of philosophy, of music, of poetry. It was a culture of depth and complexity. The American culture, as represented by this Hamburger, seemed to be a culture of simplicity, of practicality, of a kind of brutal and overwhelming efficiency, and in this war it was the brutal efficiency that was winning. The train finally arrived at its destination, Camp Algona, in the heart of rural Iowa. The camp was a sprawling, orderly city of white wooden barracks, surrounded by a high barbed wire fence, but beyond the fence, there was nothing but the flat, endless expanse of the cornfields, stretching to the horizon under a vast empty sky. It was for Günter the most profound and terrifying prison he could imagine. It was a prison not of walls, but of sheer unconquerable distance. Life in the camp was a strange mixture of rigid discipline and surprising freedom. The days were governed by a strict routine of roll calls, meals and work details. But the work itself was a continuation of the strange, unsettling education that had begun on the journey. The prisoners of Camp Algona were put to work on the local farms, helping with the harvest. Their labor desperately needed to replace the thousands of young Iowans who were now fighting in Europe and the Pacific. And it was here, in the rich black soil of Iowa, that Günter came face to face with the true engine of American power. He worked alongside American farmers, who were not the downtrodden, backward peasants of German propaganda. They were businessmen, they were mechanics, they were agronomists. They drove their tractors with a casual mastery, they talked of crop yields and soil chemistry, and they treated their German prisoners, not with hatred, but with a kind of bemused professional detachment. But it was the food, the endless staggering, almost comical abundance of it, that was the constant daily lesson. He worked in fields of corn that were not fields but forests, the stalks rising high above his head. He helped to harvest potatoes, not by the basket, but by the truckload. And he saw the livestock, the fat, healthy cattle and hogs that were the raw material for the steaks, the pork chops, and of course the hamburgers that were the staple of the American diet. And it was in the camp mess hall that the hamburger became a regular and beloved feature of their lives. It was served once, sometimes twice a week. It was a taste of America, a taste of a world that was for them both a prison and a revelation. They began to look forward to Hamburger Day with an almost childish anticipation. They would even have debates in the barracks about the best way to eat it, with ketchup, with mustard, with onions. It was a small human thing, a moment of pleasure in a life that had been stripped of almost everything. But for Günter, the hamburger was always more than just a meal. It was a symbol. It was a symbol of the vast fertile land that had produced it. It was a symbol of the industrial system that had processed it and transported it. And it was a symbol of the casual, confident and utterly baffling culture that had created it. He had been taught to see America as a weak and decadent foe. He had learned in the most visceral and undeniable way that it was a power of a kind that his own country, with its proud and ancient traditions, could not hope to match. And so as he sat in the mess hall of Camp Algona, a young defeated soldier in the heart of his enemy's country, he would eat his hamburger. And with every bite, he would be consuming not just a meal, but a lesson. It was a lesson in the true meaning of power. It was a lesson in the fallibility of his own ideology. And it was a lesson in the simple, brutal and undeniable fact that an army, and a nation, that can eat hamburgers in the middle of a world war is an army, and a nation, that has already won. The psychological landscape of Camp Algona was as flat and as subtly complex as the Iowan prairie that surrounded it. On the surface, life was a monotonous routine of work, food and confinement. But beneath this placid surface, a silent, profound and often painful transformation was taking place in the minds of the German prisoners. The hamburger had been the first chapter of a new and unsettling education. The daily life of the camp was the ongoing curriculum. The American authorities, with their pragmatic and unsentimental approach, had created an environment that was in its very structure a weapon of psychological warfare. It was a weapon that worked not by inflicting pain, but by demonstrating a better reality. The camp was a microcosm of the American system, a system that was built on order, on efficiency, and on a deep, almost unconscious belief in the power of abundance. The work program was the most direct and powerful expression of this. Every morning Günter and his comrades would be loaded onto trucks and driven out to the surrounding farms. The journey itself was a daily lesson in the geography of American power. They would pass through small towns that were not the huddled ancient villages of Germany, but open, confident communities. They saw the neat wooden houses with their well-tended lawns. They saw the high school, the Lutheran church, the local movie theater with its bright, optimistic posters. They saw the children, riding their bicycles down the paved streets, their laughter a sound that was a world away from the fearful silence of the German home front. And they saw the farms. The farms were not just farms, they were factories. They were a testament to the American genius for mechanization. The German prisoners, many of whom were from rural backgrounds, would watch in a state of stunned disbelief as a single American farmer, with his John Deere tractor and his array of complex attachments, could do the work of an entire village of German peasants. They saw the hybrid corn, a scientific marvel that produced ears that were larger and more numerous than anything they had ever seen. They saw the automated milking machines, the grain elevators that were as tall as church steeples, the vast orderly systems of irrigation. This was a world that did not just contradict their propaganda, it rendered it irrelevant. The Nazi ideology was built on the myth of Blut und Boden, the mystical connection between the German peasant and his sacred soil. It was a romantic, backward-looking ideal, a glorification of the simple pre-industrial life. And here in the heart of America, the Germans were confronted with a new and terrifying reality. The future of agriculture, and therefore the future of national power, was not in the mystical connection to the soil, but in the rational, scientific and industrial mastery of it. The relationship between the prisoners and the local Iowans was a source of constant low-grade amazement. The farmers and their families were not the hateful caricatures of the propaganda posters. They were, for the most part, decent, hard-working and deeply pragmatic people. They had a job to do to bring in the harvest, and the German prisoners were the hands that were needed to do it. The relationship was not one of friendship, but of a kind of mutual business-like respect. But in the small human interactions of a long workday, the barriers of hatred and ideology would inevitably begin to erode. A farmer's wife would bring out a tray of freshly baked cookies, a gesture of simple, unthinking hospitality that would leave the German prisoners speechless. A young American boy, the farmer's son, would shyly try out a few words of German he had learned in school. A foreman, seeing the prisoners shivering in a sudden autumn chill, would bring them a thermos of hot coffee. These were not grand acts of reconciliation. They were small, mundane moments of human connection, but they were more powerful than any lecture or propaganda film. They demonstrated in a way that was impossible to deny that the enemy was not a monolithic monster, but a collection of individual human beings, people who were capable of kindness, of humor, of a simple shared humanity. For Günter, the most powerful of these moments came one hot afternoon in a cornfield. He was working alongside the farmer, a tall, silent man named Olsen. They were loading the harvested corn onto a truck, the work repetitive and exhausting. At one point, Günter's pitchfork slipped, and he stumbled, twisting his ankle. The pain was sharp and immediate. He expected the farmer to yell at him, to curse him for his clumsiness. Instead, Olsen stopped the truck, came over and knelt down beside him. He examined Günter's ankle with a rough but gentle touch. He then helped Günter to his feet and led him to the shade of the truck. He gave him his own water canteen and told him, in slow, simple English, to rest. For the rest of the afternoon, Olsen did the work of two men, while Günter sat and watched. It was an act of quiet, unadorned decency, and it shook Günter to the core. This was not the behavior of a master to a slave, or a victor to a vanquished foe. It was the behavior of one man to another. Back in the camp, the process of re-education continued, both formally and informally. The camp's Special Projects Division, with its library of banned books and its carefully curated newspapers, was a source of constant low-grade intellectual ferment. But the most powerful education was taking place in the mess hall. The Hamburger, which had made its debut on the journey to the camp, now became a regular and celebrated part of the weekly menu. It was a taste of America, a taste of freedom, a taste of a world that was in every meaningful way more powerful and more desirable than the one they had left behind. The prisoners would line up on Hamburger Day with a sense of genuine anticipation. They would take their hamburger, and then they would go to the condiment table, a feature of the American mess hall that was a source of endless fascination. The condiment table was a symbol of the American belief in individual choice. There were bowls of sliced onions, of pickles, of lettuce, of tomatoes. There were bottles of ketchup and mustard. A man could customize his hamburger to his own personal taste. To the German prisoners, who had been raised in a culture of collective discipline and uniformity, this simple, almost trivial freedom of choice was a revelation. It was a small edible expression of the democratic ideal, and they would talk about it endlessly. They would debate the merits of ketchup versus mustard, of raw onions versus grilled. They would compare their creations. It was a way of exercising a small degree of individuality in a life that was otherwise completely regimented. It was a way of being human. But the hamburger was always more than just a meal. It was a conversation starter. It was a bridge. An American guard, seeing a prisoner struggling with the unfamiliar concept of ketchup, might come over and show him how to use the bottle. A small, simple interaction, but one that was pregnant with meaning. It was a moment of shared experience. A moment when the roles of captor and captive were momentarily forgotten. And the hamburger was a symbol of a different kind of national pride. The German pride was in the ancient, the traditional, the handcrafted. The pride of the butcher who made the perfect bratwurst. The American pride was in the modern, the efficient, the mass-produced, the pride of the system that could deliver 1 million perfectly uniform hamburger patties to 1 million soldiers and prisoners across the globe. It was a pride not of art, but of industry. And it was the industry that was winning the war. The psychological impact of this was slow, corrosive, and irresistible. The Nazi ideology was a brittle thing, built on a foundation of lies and a deliberate ignorance of the outside world. The daily reality of life in an American POW camp
with its abundance, its fairness, and its casual, confident humanity, was like a steady drip of water on that brittle foundation, and in time it was bound to crumble. For Günter, the moment of collapse came not in a sudden dramatic revelation, but in a quiet, simple, and almost unbearably poignant moment. He received a letter from his mother. It was the first he had received in almost a year. The letter was short, the handwriting was shaky, and the words were carefully chosen to pass the American censors. But the meaning was clear. The city of Essen was a ruin. The Krupp Works, the symbol of German industrial might, was a twisted, smoking wasteland. Their apartment was gone. His father was dead, killed in an air raid. His mother was living in a cellar, surviving on the charity of their neighbors. He read the letter, and then he read it again. And then he walked out of the barracks and stood by the barbed wire fence, looking out at the vast, peaceful and golden expanse of the Iowa cornfields. It was late afternoon, and the camp was quiet. In the distance, he could hear the low, gentle sound of cattle, and from the mess hall, he could smell the rich, smoky aroma of the evening meal being prepared. It was Hamburger day, and in that moment, the two worlds, the two realities, collided in his mind with the force of a physical blow. The world of his childhood, the world of German steel and German pride, was a world of smoke and rubble and death. The world of his captivity, the world of his enemy, was a world of peace, of abundance, and of the simple, life-affirming smell of grilling meat. He stood by the fence for a long time, the letter crumpled in his fist. He did not cry. The capacity for tears had been burned out of him in the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes. But he felt something shift inside him, something fundamental and irreversible. It was the feeling of a world breaking. It was the feeling of a faith dying. He had been taught to believe that he was a member of the master race, a soldier of a glorious and invincible Reich. He had been taught to believe that his enemies were weak, decadent, and corrupt. He had been taught to believe that his sacrifice, and the sacrifice of his comrades, was for a noble and righteous cause. And he now knew, with a certainty that was as clear and as cold as the Iowa winter sky, that it had all been a lie. He had been on the wrong side of history. He had fought for the darkness, not the light. And his punishment was not to be starved, or beaten, or humiliated. His punishment was to be kept alive, to be well fed, and to be forced, day after day, to confront the simple, undeniable and soul-crushing evidence of his own country's failure, and his enemy's success. That evening, he went to the mess hall. He stood in line. He was given his hamburger. He took it back to his table. And as he ate it, he was not tasting a meal. He was tasting the ashes of his former life. He was tasting the bitter, complex, and ultimately liberating flavor of the truth. He was no longer a soldier of the Reich. He was just a young man, a long way from home, who was beginning, for the first time in his life, to understand the true meaning of the world. And the lesson had been taught to him, not by a book or a lecture, but by the simple, profound and world-changing reality of an American hamburger. The unraveling of a worldview is not a sudden event, it is a slow, painful and often silent process. But Günter, the letter from his mother was the moment the foundation cracked, but the weeks and months that followed were a process of slow structural collapse. The daily routines of the camp, which had once been a source of bewilderment, now became a series of quiet, relentless confirmations of a new and terrible truth. The work in the fields, which had once been a mere physical chore, now became a form of meditation, a time for quiet, agonizing reflection. As he worked alongside the Iowan farmers, he began to see them not as his captors, but as a different kind of soldier, a soldier in a war of production. He saw the pride they took in their work, the deep practical knowledge they had of their land and their machines. He saw the way they managed their farms, not as feudal estates, but as modern, efficient businesses. And he saw the fruits of their labor, the incredible, almost obscene, abundance of food that they produced. He was a part of this machine now. A small captive cog, and he could see with a clarity that was both fascinating and horrifying, how this machine was fueling the war that had destroyed his own country. He began to talk more with the other prisoners, not about the old glories of the Reich, but about the new realities they were confronting. He found that he was not alone in his crisis of faith. Many of the older prisoners, men who had been captured in North Africa or Italy, had been wrestling with these same doubts for years. They had had more time to observe, to reflect, to let the slow poison of American abundance work its way into their souls. An older sergeant, a man who had fought in the First World War, told him a story. In the last war, he said, his voice a low rumble, we were starving, and the British were starving. It was a war of equals, a war of mutual misery. This war, this is different. They are not starving. They are throwing away more food than we ever had. This is not a war of equals, this is a war of a rich man against a poor man. And the poor man always loses. The camp's re-education program, which Günter had once dismissed as crude propaganda, now began to take on a new and more sinister meaning. He attended the lectures, he read the books, he watched the films, and he began to see that the Americans were not just trying to feed his body, they were trying to capture his mind. They were systematically dismantling his entire intellectual and moral universe, piece by piece. He read the works of the exiled German authors, and he discovered a Germany he had never known, a Germany of humanism, of democracy, of a vibrant and critical intellectual life, a Germany that had been brutally silenced by the regime he had served. He watched the films of the concentration camps, and he was forced to confront the fact that the stories he had dismissed as enemy lies were, in fact, a horrifying and undeniable truth. And he listened to the lectures on American democracy. He heard about the concept of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. He heard about the idea of individual rights, of freedom of speech, of a system of checks and balances. It was a political philosophy that was so completely at odds with the world of absolute obedience and collective will that he had been raised in that it was almost incomprehensible. And yet, he could see the evidence of its success all around him, in the confidence of his captors, in the wealth of their country, in the simple undeniable fact that they had won the war. The Hamburger, which had once been a simple shocking object, now became a symbol of this entire complex system. It was a symbol of the agricultural power of the American heartland. It was a symbol of the industrial efficiency of the American factory. It was a symbol of the democratic culture of abundance, a culture that believed that even the common man had a right to a simple, affordable pleasure. And it was a symbol of a war that had been won not by a superior spirit, but by a superior system of production. As the war in Europe came to an end, a new and more intense phase of the re-education program began. The Americans, now faced with the monumental task of rebuilding a democratic Germany from the ashes of the Third Reich, saw the hundreds of thousands of German prisoners in their camps as a unique opportunity. These were the men who would be returning to Germany. The men who would be the future leaders of their communities, of their businesses, of their new democratic government. And the Americans were determined to send them back not as defeated and resentful enemies, but as converts, as missionaries for the American way of life. The program was called intellectual diversion, a bland bureaucratic name for a radical and ambitious experiment in mass psychological transformation. The camps were flooded with new books, new films, new lecturers. The prisoners were offered courses in American history, in American government, in the English language. They were encouraged to form debating societies, to publish their own uncensored newspapers, to engage in the kind of free and open intellectual exchange that had been impossible in Germany for over a decade. For Günter, this was the final and most profound stage of his captivity. He threw himself into the educational programs with a desperate, almost feverish intensity. He was a young man who had been raised on a diet of lies, and he was starving for the truth. He read everything he could get his hands on. He argued and debated with his fellow prisoners late into the night. He learned to speak a halting but functional English. He was, in a very real sense, being deprogrammed and reprogrammed. He was shedding the skin of the Hitler Youth and growing the new skin of a Democrat. But it was not an easy or a painless process. It was a process that was filled with guilt, with confusion, and with a deep and abiding sense of loss. He was losing his country, his identity, the entire framework of meaning that had given his young life its purpose, and he was replacing it with the culture of his enemy. A culture that he was still not sure he fully understood or trusted. The Hamburger, in this final phase of his captivity, became a symbol of this deep and painful ambivalence. He still enjoyed it, he still looked forward to it, but now he ate it with a new and more complex understanding. It was the taste of his defeat, but it was also the taste of his future. It was the taste of a world that had destroyed his own, but it was also the taste of a world that was offering him a second chance. When the day finally came for him to be repatriated, to be sent back to the ruins of his homeland, He was a different man. He was no longer the arrogant, fanatical young soldier who had gone to war believing in the myth of the master race. He was a quiet, thoughtful, and deeply scarred young man. A man who had been forced to confront the very worst of his own country's history and the very best of his enemies. He stood on the deck of the transport ship, looking back at the skyline of New York City, and he felt a strange and overwhelming mixture of emotions. He felt a deep and abiding shame for the crimes that had been committed in his name. He felt a profound sense of loss for the country and the comrades he had lost. But he also felt a small, fragile, and almost heretical flicker of something else: gratitude. He was grateful for his survival. He was grateful for the strange, unexpected kindness of his captors. And he was grateful for the education he had received, the education that had been delivered to him in the classrooms, in the libraries, and above all in the mess halls of the American prisoner of war camps.
He knew that he was returning to a world of hunger, of ruin, of a deep and profound national despair, and he knew that the stories he had to tell, the stories of the vast, untouched and abundant land he had seen, the stories of the strange, confident and generous people he had met, would be met with disbelief and resentment. But he also knew that he had a duty to tell them. He had a duty to be a witness to the truth that had been revealed to him. And he knew that the symbol of that truth, the single, simple and unforgettable image that he would carry with him for the rest of his life, was the image of his first American hamburger. It was the image of a world that he had been taught to hate, a world that had defeated him, and a world that had in the end saved him. It was the image of a new and different kind of power, a power that was not measured in guns or in tanks, but in the simple, undeniable and world-changing reality of a piece of grilled meat on a soft white bun. It was the taste of a new century, and it was a taste that would in time help to build a new and better Germany from the ashes of the old. The journey from the transit camps in France to the permanent prisoner of war camps in the heart of the United States was for the German prisoners a journey into the belly of the beast. It was a slow, surreal and deeply unsettling experience, a rolling diorama of American abundance that unfolded outside the windows of their trains. The trains themselves were a revelation. Instead of being packed into the notorious 40 and 8 inches boxcars of European military transport, cars designed to hold 40 men or 8 horses, the German POWs found themselves in passenger coaches. They were worn perhaps, and the seats were not plush, but they were actual passenger cars, with windows, seats and a relative degree of comfort. This initial act of civility was so unexpected that it immediately put the prisoners on edge. This could not be real. It had to be a prelude to some new, unknown form of cruelty. As the trains rumbled away from the East Coast ports, the sheer, unscarred vastness of the American landscape began to work its psychological magic. To men who had spent their lives in the crowded, ancient landscapes of Europe, a continent where every square inch of land was marked by history, by borders, by the scars of old wars, the American heartland was a thing of almost terrifying emptiness and scale. They would travel for hours, for days, and see nothing but an endless rolling ocean of green and gold, the cornfields of the Midwest, the wheat fields of the Great Plains. The sky was bigger, the horizon was farther away. It was a landscape that seemed to have no end, and therefore no limits. A German officer, a veteran of the panzer spearheads that had raced across the compact, well-defined plains of France, looked out of his window at the endless expanse of Kansas and muttered to his adjutant, "How can you conquer a country that has no end?" The towns and cities they passed through were another source of constant low-grade shock. They were not the ancient walled cities of Europe, but sprawling, open and defiantly modern creations, and they were utterly, completely untouched by the war. There were no bombed-out buildings, no piles of rubble, no skeletal remains of factories. The church steeples were intact, the bridges stood strong, the houses were painted and whole. At night, the trains did not pass through a blacked-out, fearful landscape. Instead, the prisoners were confronted with a spectacle of almost obscene carelessness: light. Every farmhouse had a light burning in its window. Every small town was a galaxy of streetlights, illuminated storefronts, and the warm glow of domesticity. For men who had spent years under the strict blackout regulations of the Reich, who associated the night with the drone of bombers and the terror of the air raid shelter, the sight of this casual, profligate use of electricity was a profound and deeply unsettling statement of American power. It said simply, "We are not afraid. The war is over there, here life goes on." And then there was the food, a constant recurring theme of their journey. In the dining cars they were served meals that were by their standards feasts: white bread, butter, meat, coffee, milk. The German prisoners, many of whom were still suffering from the long-term effects of malnutrition, ate with a mixture of ravenous hunger and deep abiding shame. They knew that their families back in Germany were queuing for hours for a few potatoes and a loaf of black bread. They were, in the great cruel irony of the war, eating better as prisoners than their loved ones were as citizens of the triumphant Reich. And everywhere they saw the automobile. It was not a luxury as it was in Germany, a symbol of status reserved for the party elite and the wealthy. In America, it was a part of the landscape as common as trees. They saw farmers driving pickup trucks, housewives driving sedans to the grocery store, teenagers cruising down the main streets of small towns in their jalopies. The parking lots of the factories they passed were filled with thousands of cars, the private property of the workers. This was a level of mass democratic mobility that the German people's car, the Volkswagen, had only ever promised. The Americans were not just building a motorized army, they were a motorized civilization. Upon arrival at their final destinations, camps with names like Camp Hahn in Texas, Camp Ruston in Louisiana, or Camp Algona in Iowa, the indoctrination into the American way of life and the American way of food began in earnest. The camps themselves were built to a standard, efficient design, a testament to American logistical prowess. They were not death camps, not concentration camps in the German model. They were, in the cold bureaucratic language of the US Army, internment facilities, designed to be secure, humane, and above all orderly. The mess hall was the heart of the camp, and it was here that the psychological war was fought most relentlessly. The US Army, following the dictates of the Geneva Convention, had a simple and astonishing policy. A prisoner of war was to be given the same daily ration as a baseline American soldier. This was a decision born not of altruism, but of a pragmatic, almost industrial logic. It was easier to supply the camps with the same bulk foodstuffs that were supplied to the training bases across the country than it was to create a separate, inferior logistical chain. The result, however, was a daily assault of abundance on the psyches of the German prisoners. And it was in these mess halls that the Hamburger made its regular triumphant appearance. It was the perfect food for the institutional setting of a POW camp. It was cheap, it was easy to cook in massive quantities, and it was, to the surprise of the American cooks, wildly popular with the German prisoners. They might have been initially baffled by it, but they quickly came to appreciate its simple, savory, and undeniably meaty qualities. It was a taste of America, and it was a taste of a world that was in every meaningful way more powerful than their own. But the Hamburger was just the beginning. The German prisoners were about to be introduced to an entire constellation of American culinary creations, each one a small, edible lesson in the nature of their captor. They were introduced to hot dogs, another mystery of processed meat on a soft white bun. They were introduced to corn on the cob, a vegetable they had only ever known as animal feed in Germany. They were introduced to peanut butter, to jello, to pancakes with maple syrup, to a whole universe of foods that were the product of a nation with a surplus of everything: land, calories, sugar, and confidence. And it was the sugar that was perhaps the greatest shock of all. In wartime Germany, sugar was a strategic commodity, as precious as gasoline. It was strictly rationed, a few grams per week, a memory of sweetness in a bitter time. In the American POW camps, sugar was a condiment. It sat in bowls on the tables, next to the salt and pepper, for the prisoners to spoon into their coffee as they wished. They could have 1 spoonful, or 5. No one was counting. This single small detail was, for many of the Germans, the most profound and demoralizing evidence of American wealth. A nation that did not count its sugar was a nation that could not be beaten. This daily relentless exposure to American abundance had a slow, corrosive effect on the morale and the ideology of the German prisoners. The Nazi diehards, the true believers, tried to resist it. They would organize boycotts of certain foods, they would sneer at their comrades who took a second helping, they would whisper that the food was poisoned or designed to make them soft. But it was a losing battle. The simple biological imperative of hunger is more powerful than any ideology. And the food was not just abundant, it was good. The American army, with its typical systematic approach, had even established bakeries in the camps, where German prisoners, who had been bakers in civilian life, were put to work baking bread for their fellow captives. But they were not baking the hard, dense rye bread of the Wehrmacht. They were given white flour, yeast and sugar, and they were taught to bake the soft, light and slightly sweet white bread that was the American standard. For a German baker, to work with such high-quality ingredients, to produce a loaf of bread that was a luxury item back home, was a strange and deeply unsettling experience. He was, in effect, using his own skills to produce the evidence of his nation's defeat. The story of the food in the POW camps is the story of a psychological campaign that was never officially declared, but was waged with devastating effectiveness. It was a campaign fought not with weapons, but with calories. Every meal was a demonstration of American power. Every hamburger, every hot dog, every spoonful of sugar was a small edible piece of propaganda, a message that was more powerful than any leaflet or radio broadcast. The message was simple: we are so rich, so powerful, that we can afford to feed our enemies better than your own leaders could feed you, their chosen soldiers. For the young German grenadier, Günter, the hamburger he ate in that transit camp in Normandy was the beginning of a long and painful education. It was the first crack in the wall of his certainty. In the months and years to come, in the camps of the American heartland, that crack would widen into a chasm. He would be exposed to a world of such casual, overwhelming abundance that it would force him to question everything he had ever been taught to believe about his country, about his enemy, and about himself. He had been sent to conquer a world, and instead he had been conquered, not by a superior soldier, but by a superior system, a system so powerful that its very leftovers were a feast. And the symbol of that conquest, the enduring memory of his defeat, was not the sight of an American tank, or the sound of an American gun, but the simple, shocking and world-changing taste of his first American hamburger. The transition from the initial shock of American food to the long, strange rhythm of life in a POW camp was a journey of psychological acclimatization. For Günter and his comrades, the first few weeks were a period of intense observation and whispered debate. The hamburger had been the opening salvo, but the daily reality of the camp was a relentless multi-front assault on their preconceived notions. They were men who had been trained to see the world in stark, brutal terms: friend and foe, strength and weakness, honor and disgrace. The American camp, with its baffling mixture of strict confinement and casual civility, did not fit into any of these categories. It was a gray zone of the soul, and it was deeply unsettling. The official doctrine of the camps was laid out in the Articles of the Geneva Convention, a document that the US Army, to the astonishment of the Germans, took with a surprising degree of seriousness. The convention stipulated that prisoners of war were to be treated humanely. They were to be housed in conditions equivalent to those of the captor's own garrison troops. They were to be given adequate food and medical care, and they could be made to work, but only on non-military projects, and they were to be paid for their labor. To the German prisoners, who came from a regime that had rewritten the rules of war to suit its own brutal ideology, this adherence to a code of international law was a source of both cynical amusement and grudging respect. They could not decide if the Americans were hopelessly naive or admirably principled. The work program was one of the most significant aspects of their captivity. With millions of American men serving overseas, the United States was facing a severe labor shortage, particularly in the agricultural sector. The hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war were a vast, untapped labor pool, and so, a system was established. Farmers and canneries could contract for POW labor from the nearby camps. Every morning, trucks would arrive at the camp gates, and the German prisoners, under the watchful eyes of a few American guards, would be driven out to the farms and fields of the American heartland. For men who had been confined behind barbed wire, these work details were a window into another world. They were a chance to breathe the free air, to see the landscape, and to have direct personal contact with American civilians. And it was here in the cotton fields of Mississippi, the logging camps of Wisconsin, and the sugar beet fields of Colorado, that the true staggering scale of American abundance was revealed. Günter, who had grown up in a small village in Bavaria, where the fields were small, and the work was done by hand, or with the help of a single aging horse, was sent to work on a farm in Iowa. The first time he saw the farmer's equipment, he was speechless. The farmer had not one, but two tractors,
massive green John Deere machines that could plow more in a day than Günter's entire village could plow in a week. He had a combine harvester, a monstrous self-propelled machine that cut, threshed and bagged the wheat in a single continuous operation. It was a level of mechanization that was pure science fiction to the young German. He had been taught that the German peasant, with his deep mystical connection to the soil, was the backbone of the Reich. But here was a single American farmer, with his machines and his hybrid seeds, who could outproduce an entire German village. It was a humbling and deeply demoralizing realization. The relationship between the prisoners and the civilians they worked for was often a strange and complex one. At first there was fear and suspicion on both sides. The American farmers, many of whom had sons or brothers fighting in Europe, were wary of having the enemy working on their land. The German prisoners, indoctrinated with stories of American hatred, expected to be treated with cruelty and contempt. But the shared reality of hard physical labor has a way of breaking down barriers. The farmers quickly discovered that the German prisoners were, for the most part, hard workers. Many of them were from rural backgrounds themselves and understood the rhythms of the land. And the Germans discovered that the American civilians were not the monsters of Goebbels' propaganda. They were, for the most part, decent, pragmatic, and often surprisingly kind. A farmer's wife would bring out a pitcher of cold lemonade on a hot afternoon. A foreman would share his cigarettes during a break. These were small gestures, but in the context of their captivity, they were enormous. They were acts of human connection that chipped away at the edifice of official hatred. There were, of course, moments of tension. A prisoner who was caught slacking would be reprimanded. A farmer who was seen as being too harsh would find his tools mysteriously broken the next day. But by and large, a grudging respect developed. The Americans respected the Germans' work ethic, and the Germans respected the Americans' fairness and their incredible productivity. But the most powerful lessons were often the silent ones. They were in the sight of the farmers' children, well-fed and well-clothed, playing in the yard. They were in the sight of the farmer's wife, driving her own car into town to buy groceries from a store that was filled with an endless variety of goods. They were in the sight of the local newspaper, left on the porch, with its headlines about the war on one page, and its advertisements for refrigerators and washing machines on another. This was the reality that confronted the German prisoners every day, a nation so rich and so powerful that it could fight a global war without sacrificing its own comfortable way of life. Inside the camps, a complex and vibrant society began to develop. The Germans, with their characteristic love of order and organization, recreated a semblance of their own world behind the barbed wire. They organized sports leagues, with fiercely competitive soccer matches that drew huge crowds of both prisoners and American guards. They formed orchestras and theater groups, staging performances of Goethe and Schiller in the camp mess halls. They established universities, with prisoners who had been professors and teachers in civilian life, giving lectures on everything from engineering to philosophy. The camps became, in a strange way, oases of high German culture in the middle of the American prairie. The American camp authorities, for the most part, encouraged these activities. Their primary concern was security and order. A busy, engaged prisoner was a less troublesome prisoner, but they also saw an opportunity. In late 1943, a secret and highly controversial program was established, known as the Special Projects Division. Its official purpose was re-education. Its real purpose was denazification. The program was run by a small group of American academics, many of them German-born intellectuals who had fled the Nazi regime. They understood the German mindset, and they knew that crude, heavy-handed propaganda would be counterproductive. Their approach was subtle and sophisticated. They began by providing the camp libraries with a wide range of books that had been banned in the Third Reich. The works of Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, and other authors who had been condemned as un-German. They started camp newspapers that were written and edited by carefully selected anti-Nazi prisoners. These newspapers would print news from the war, taken from American wire services, presenting a picture of the military situation that was starkly different from the triumphant fantasies of the German propaganda ministry. And they brought in lecturers and speakers, both American and German-born, to lead discussions on topics that were taboo in the Reich: the meaning of democracy, the history of German militarism, the concept of individual rights. The most powerful and controversial part of the program came in the final months of the war, when the camps were shown films. Not the Hollywood comedies and musicals of the earlier entertainment program, but the raw, brutal and horrifying footage that had been taken by Allied cameramen at the newly liberated concentration camps of Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. The reaction of the German prisoners to these films was a mixture of stunned disbelief, horrified denial, and profound soul-shattering shame. They were confronted with images of a barbarity so extreme that they could not at first believe that their own countrymen were responsible. This, they told themselves, was a trick, a piece of clever American propaganda. But the evidence was overwhelming, and as letters from home began to arrive, confirming the stories, the denial began to crumble, replaced by a terrible, sickening realization. The regime they had fought for, the cause to which they had dedicated their lives, was not just a military failure, it was a moral catastrophe. The Hamburger had been the first gentle crack in the foundation of their worldview. The films of the death camps were the earthquake that brought the entire structure crashing down. The story of the German prisoners of war in America is the story of a slow, painful and ultimately transformative journey from certainty to doubt, from arrogance to a dawning and terrible self-knowledge. And at every step of that journey, there was the silent, ubiquitous and powerful presence of American abundance. It was in the food they ate, the clothes they wore, the trucks they rode in, the tools they worked with. It was in the casual, taken for granted wealth of the civilian society they observed from behind the wire. This abundance was not a deliberate weapon, but it was perhaps the most effective weapon of all. It did not kill the body, it captured the mind. It demonstrated in a way that was more powerful than any battle, that the American system, the system of democratic capitalism that the Nazis had derided as weak and decadent, was in fact a system of almost unimaginable power. When the war was over and the time came for the prisoners to be repatriated, they were no longer the same men who had arrived 2 or 3 years earlier. They were men who had been defeated, not just on the battlefield, but in their most deeply held convictions. They were returning to a country that was not just physically in ruins, but morally in ruins. And they were carrying with them a set of experiences that would be almost impossible to communicate to their countrymen who had not shared them. How could they explain the taste of a hamburger to a wife who had been living on boiled potatoes? How could they describe the sight of an Iowa cornfield to a father whose home had been turned to rubble? How could they explain the strange, unsettling kindness of their captors to a people who had been taught to see them as monsters? Many of the returning prisoners would play a vital role in the rebuilding of West Germany. They had seen with their own eyes a functioning democracy and a prosperous market economy. They had seen a society that was not built on the glorification of the state and the subjugation of the individual. They had, in the most unlikely of classrooms, received a profound education in the American way of life. The story of Günter, the young Panzer Grenadier, is the story of this transformation. He had been captured as a true believer, a young man who was willing to die for his Führer and his fatherland. He would return to Germany as a man who was burdened by a terrible knowledge, but also imbued with a fragile new hope. He had seen the worst of what his own country was capable of, and he had seen the strange, contradictory, and overwhelmingly powerful reality of his enemy. His journey had begun with a simple, shocking taste of a food he had never known. The hamburger was the symbol of that initial, bewildering encounter. It was the symbol of an abundance that defied the logic of a world at war. It was the symbol of a culture that was so confident, so powerful, that it could afford to be generous even in its moment of triumph. The German soldiers had been taught to laugh at the softness of America. In the end, it was that very softness, the soft white bun and the juicy savory meat of a simple hamburger, that would prove to be the most indigestible and world-changing weapon of all. The psychological landscape of Camp Algarna was as flat and as subtly complex as the Iowan prairie that surrounded it. On the surface, life was a monotonous routine of work, food and confinement. But beneath this placid surface, a silent, profound and often painful transformation was taking place in the minds of the German prisoners. The hamburger had been the first chapter of a new and unsettling education. The daily life of the camp was the ongoing curriculum. The American authorities, with their pragmatic and unsentimental approach, had created an environment that was in its very structure a weapon of psychological warfare. It was a weapon that worked not by inflicting pain but by demonstrating a better reality. The camp was a microcosm of the American system, a system that was built on order, on efficiency, and on a deep, almost unconscious belief in the power of abundance. The work program was the most direct and powerful expression of this. Every morning, Günter and his comrades would be loaded onto trucks and driven out to the surrounding farms. The journey itself was a daily lesson in the geography of American power. They would pass through small towns that were not the huddled ancient villages of Germany, but open, confident communities. They saw the neat wooden houses with their well-tended lawns. They saw the high school, the Lutheran church, the local movie theater with its bright, optimistic posters. They saw the children, riding their bicycles down the paved streets, their laughter a sound that was a world away from the fearful silence of the German home front.
And they saw the farms. The farms were not just farms, they were factories. They were a testament to the American genius for mechanization. The German prisoners, many of whom were from rural backgrounds, would watch in a state of stunned disbelief as a single American farmer, with his John Deere tractor and his array of complex attachments, could do the work of an entire village of German peasants. They saw the hybrid corn, a scientific marvel that produced ears that were larger and more numerous than anything they had ever seen. They saw the automated milking machines, the grain elevators that were as tall as church steeples, the vast orderly systems of irrigation. This was a world that did not just contradict their propaganda, it rendered it irrelevant. The Nazi ideology was built on the myth of Blut und Boden, the mystical connection between the German peasant and his sacred soil. It was a romantic, backward-looking ideal, a glorification of the simple pre-industrial life. And here in the heart of America, the Germans were confronted with a new and terrifying reality. The future of agriculture, and therefore the future of national power, was not in the mystical connection to the soil, but in the rational, scientific and industrial mastery of it. The relationship between the prisoners and the local Iowans was a source of constant low-grade amazement. The farmers and their families were not the hateful caricatures of the propaganda posters. They were for the most part, decent, hard-working and deeply pragmatic people. They had a job to do, to bring in the harvest, and the German prisoners were the hands that were needed to do it. The relationship was not one of friendship, but of a kind of mutual business-like respect. But in the small human interactions of a long workday, the barriers of hatred and ideology would inevitably begin to erode. A farmer's wife would bring out a tray of freshly baked cookies, a gesture of simple, unthinking hospitality that would leave the German prisoners speechless. A young American boy, the farmer's son, would shyly try out a few words of German he had learned in school. A foreman, seeing the prisoners shivering in a sudden autumn chill, would bring them a thermos of hot coffee. These were not grand acts of reconciliation, they were small, mundane moments of human connection, but they were more powerful than any lecture or propaganda film. They demonstrated, in a way that was impossible to deny, that the enemy was not a monolithic monster, but a collection of individual human beings, people who were capable of kindness, of humor, of a simple shared humanity. For Günter, the most powerful of these moments came one hot afternoon in a cornfield. He was working alongside the farmer, a tall, silent man named Olsen. They were loading the harvested corn onto a truck, the work repetitive and exhausting. At one point, Günter's pitchfork slipped, and he stumbled, twisting his ankle. The pain was sharp and immediate. He expected the farmer to yell at him, to curse him for his clumsiness. Instead, Olsen stopped the truck, came over, and knelt down beside him. He examined Günter's ankle with a rough but gentle touch. He then helped Günter to his feet, and led him to the shade of the truck. He gave him his own water canteen, and told him, in slow, simple English, to rest. For the rest of the afternoon, Olsen did the work of two men, while Günter sat and watched. It was an act of quiet, unadorned decency, and it shook Günter to the core. This was not the behavior of a master to a slave, or a victor to a vanquished foe. It was the behavior of one man to another. Back in the camp, the process of re-education continued, both formally and informally. The camp's Special Projects Division, with its library of banned books and its carefully curated newspapers, was a source of constant low-grade intellectual ferment. But the most powerful education was taking place in the mess hall. The Hamburger, which had made its debut on the journey to the camp, now became a regular and celebrated part of the weekly menu. It was a taste of America, a taste of freedom, a taste of a world that was in every meaningful way more powerful and more desirable than the one they had left behind. The prisoners would line up on Hamburger Day with a sense of genuine anticipation. They would take their hamburger, and then they would go to the condiment table, a feature of the American mess hall that was a source of endless fascination. The condiment table was a symbol of the American belief in individual choice. There were bowls of sliced onions, of pickles, of lettuce, of tomatoes. There were bottles of ketchup and mustard. A man could customize his hamburger to his own personal taste. To the German prisoners, who had been raised in a culture of collective discipline and uniformity, this simple, almost trivial freedom of choice was a revelation. It was a small, edible expression of the democratic ideal. And they would talk about it endlessly. They would debate the merits of ketchup versus mustard, of raw onions versus grilled. They would compare their creations. It was a way of exercising a small degree of individuality in a life that was otherwise completely regimented. It was a way of being human. But the hamburger was always more than just a meal. It was a conversation starter. It was a bridge. An American guard, seeing a prisoner struggling with the unfamiliar concept of ketchup, might come over and show him how to use the bottle. A small, simple interaction, but one that was pregnant with meaning. It was a moment of shared experience, a moment when the roles of captor and captive were momentarily forgotten. And the hamburger was a symbol of a different kind of national pride. The German pride was in the ancient, the traditional, the handcrafted. The pride of the butcher who made the perfect bratwurst. The American pride was in the modern, the efficient, the mass-produced, the pride of the system that could deliver 1 million perfectly uniform hamburger patties to 1 million soldiers and prisoners across the globe. It was a pride not of art, but of industry. And it was the industry that was winning the war. The psychological impact of this was slow, corrosive and irresistible. The Nazi ideology was a brittle thing, built on a foundation of lies and a deliberate ignorance of the outside world. The daily reality of life in an American palm camp, with its abundance, its fairness, and its casual confident humanity, was like a steady drip of water on that brittle foundation. And in time, it was bound to crumble. For Günter, the moment of collapse came not in a sudden dramatic revelation, but in a quiet, simple and almost unbearably poignant moment. He received a letter from his mother. It was the first he had received in almost a year. The letter was short, the handwriting was shaky, and the words were carefully chosen to pass the American censors. But the meaning was clear. The city of Essen was a ruin. The Krupp works, the symbol of German industrial might, was a twisted, smoking wasteland. Their apartment was gone. His father was dead, killed in an air raid. His mother was living in a cellar, surviving on the charity of their neighbors. He read the letter, and then he read it again. And then he walked out of the barracks and stood by the barbed wire fence, looking out at the vast, peaceful and golden expanse of the Iowa cornfields. It was late afternoon, and the camp was quiet. In the distance, he could hear the low, gentle sound of cattle. And from the mess hall, he could smell the rich, smoky aroma of the evening meal being prepared. It was hamburger day. And in that moment, the two worlds, the two realities, collided in his mind with the force of a physical blow. The world of his childhood, the world of German steel and German pride, was a world of smoke and rubble and death. The world of his captivity, the world of his enemy, was a world of peace, of abundance, and of the simple life-affirming smell of grilling meat. He stood by the fence for a long time, the letter crumpled in his fist. He did not cry. The capacity for tears had been burned out of him in the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes. But he felt something shift inside him, something fundamental and irreversible. It was the feeling of a world breaking. It was the feeling of a faith dying. He had been taught to believe that he was a member of the master race, a soldier of a glorious and invincible Reich. He had been taught to believe that his enemies were weak, decadent and corrupt. He had been taught to believe that his sacrifice, and the sacrifice of his comrades, was for a noble and righteous cause. And he now knew, with a certainty that was as clear and as cold as the Iowa winter sky, that it had all been a lie. He had been on the wrong side of history. He had fought for the darkness, not the light. And his punishment was not to be starved, or beaten, or humiliated. His punishment was to be kept alive, to be well fed, and to be forced, day after day, to confront the simple, undeniable and soul-crushing evidence of his own country's failure and his enemy's success. That evening, he went to the mess hall. He stood in line. He was given his hamburger. He took it back to his table. And as he ate it, he was not tasting a meal. He was tasting the ashes of his former life. He was tasting the bitter, complex, and ultimately liberating flavor of the truth. He was no longer a soldier of the Reich. He was just a young man, a long way from home, who was beginning for the first time in his life to understand the true meaning of the world. And the lesson had been taught to him, not by a book or a lecture, but by the simple, profound, and world-changing reality of an American hamburger.